Test, 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 test. There we go.
Well, welcome to our series of forums, and we have a very good one today. This is our 20th year. Many of you know that. 1998, my mother, Jean Argetsinger, and John Bishop, head of IMSA, with some help from John Saunders of ISC, put together this wonderful organization. And for those of you who don't know, I'm J.C. Argetsinger, and I was one of the original board members. And I'm here today in place of Tom Wiedemann, our executive director, who is ailing at the moment. Nothing serious, of course. But safety has always been a concern at Watkins Glen, and we have a long history in innovations. And we brought together a group of experts who I hope will educate you and amuse you. I'm going to introduce our moderator in a moment, but first a little personal note. Dr. James J. Norton is here in the front row. And Dr. Norton, World War II veteran and served as an occupation doctor in Japan, was our first race director. And he gave up the lights, the big city lights, and came here to be a general surgeon and a general practitioner in the Watkins Glen area. And there's hardly a day that goes by when we're walking down the street and someone will say, gee, you delivered my child, or you took out my gallbladder, or you saved my life. Anyway, Dr. Norton, who was not necessarily a car enthusiast, volunteered to be the first director. And he, frankly, was quite appalled with what he saw, the primitive safety conditions in 1950. And he was a fierce advocate for many of the changes which came about in Watkins Glen. Our moderator today is a lifelong car enthusiast. He grew up right on the old racetrack, international motor racing historian and author and a radio personality. He raced himself. He's been a safety worker at the track, many tracks. He was involved in international racing with the Tyrrell firm. He traveled with them throughout Europe and in America. And that is Rick Huey, who, since he is retired from his profession, has really been one of our chief archivists. He's working right now down at the Welliver warehouse, sorting through our huge Sports Car Club of America archive. And he's doing a great job, and his heart is with us, and we're so lucky to have somebody of his talent to be with us and part of the organization. Rick, if you could come up.
Thank you very much, J.C. Thank you. Our program today covering a wide range of safety topics. And our first speaker will be Dr. James Norton, MD, involved, as J.C. was saying, in the early days. Doc, would you care if I come down to you, or would you like to come up? Oh, come on up. Come on up. We'll get you on the internet here. As J.C. was telling us, you got concerned at the early races, and you met a guy named Fred German.
Tell us a little bit about that. Well, is this on? Yes. Met Fred German. How many of you, raise your hands, knew Fred? Fred was a great guy. He was an employee, or I guess he ran Eastman Kodak. But he and I met after the 1950 race. At that time, the medical part of the races had been thought of, but not thought very hard of. And we, in those days, the funeral directors had beautiful automobiles, hearses, called hearses. And by putting a red light on the roof, they turned it into an ambulance, being the only vehicle that could take a stretcher. And so we had a group of these ambulances around the track. And my first introduction to road racing in the United States was at the Schoolhouse Corners. Most of you don't know that, but if you know the old track, it was a cornerstone of a county road and the two county roads. And we occupied the hearse or ambulance, whichever you want to call it. and waited for the race to begin. I knew absolutely nothing about auto racing. Grew up in the farming country, the Mohawk Valley, and beside the family car, which was usually many years old, we raced with a Model A John Deere plowing tractor, which did not give us an awful lot of experience for road racing. And we stayed up there on the corners, and the race began, and the drivers were going by, and one of them slowed down long enough to say, "They need you back there." And that was counterclockwise to where the cars were coming from. So we got in our ambulance and went there. And many of you know who I'm going to mention. Sam Collier had skidded and lost control on the long stretch just before the overhead bridge, and had spun out, and according to witnesses, the car had tumbled front to back several times and landed in a field. There were a number of people watching the race even up there, and they went to the scene immediately, and we arrived just a couple minutes later. And I want to tell you, I don't know how they train race drivers nowadays, but the way they trained me was being in that ambulance going counterclockwise against the race cars coming clockwise. And I always thought that in the races you all went in the same direction. But anyway, we got there, and Mr. Collier was badly hurt, and I don't think he was really alive when we got there, but we managed to get him extricated and get him to the hospital. That was not my favorite way of learning about racing, but since then I met many of the fine people that put on the Grand Prix races, and the Watkins Glen name became known all over, and here we are talking about it. The communications was really primitive in our view of how things are today. And the notice that we got to get ready was to bring a medical kit, and that was it.
Did you create, was there like a hospital at, say, a central location or an aid station or different aid stations?
None of the above. And what we did was we had a 50-bed general hospital in a nearby village, Montour Falls, and we did all the usual work you do in a general hospital, but all of our staff joined together and were distributed around the track at intervals to be there as needed, and we were needed, as I just mentioned with the Sam Collier thing, and our hospital was in support of us, and then of course nearby in Elmira and Corning there were other hospitals, and as years went by we made many changes and improvements in it, but not to the extent that we have today, that beautiful track.
Right. The early days when you talked to Fred German at the county courthouse building, was he saying, "Hey, we need a medical team"? What was his interest?
Any of you remember Fred German? There's a man that does. Fred was high in the Eastman Kodak Company, came down, and following this first race, 1950, which I participated in, and the fatality that occurred, the Chamber of Commerce decided to have a meeting and bring those people who knew anything about racing, besides John Deere's, and had a meeting. And as I got there, Fred German, whom I had yet to meet, was just coming out of a meeting with the city fathers and the race interested people, and doing a post-mortem. I hate that term when it comes to racing. And they he was just coming out, and he said, well, I talked to him, who are you? And we introduced each other, and they said, well, they mentioned your name, you're next. So I got up and I gave an eloquent recitation of my experience with that race and the fatality. And I went on, and little by little the board drifted off, nodded, and I finally got through, much to their appreciation. And they said, okay. All right, Dr. Norton. Outside is a fellow named Fred German. You and Fred get together and decide what we want to have done here, and we'll get it done. And that's when I went out and met Fred German. And he was a great organizer. We went over the race in detail, set up a lot of the protocols of what we needed to have to make racing a comfortable and safe operation over these county roads. And that held until we went down the village and set up headquarters there.
And you traveled with Fred German and the race communications group to other racetracks too, didn't you?
No, I did not. I had all I could do to handle Niagara Falls and Schuyler County, but Fred did, and he learned a lot, and he's shared it with me. And I went and talked to him several times, and he came down. He was a guest at our house, and we got the race medical coverage up. And we're dealing with a small rural hospital, and then with two much larger hospitals, Corning, Elmira, and so forth.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Norton, for coming and being part of our program today. And we're very pleased that you could be here with us and share your story. Thank you. Thank you. When we talk about those early days, it wasn't just the safety of the people. We're talking about the safety of the vehicles, and the vehicle inspection was a very big part of racing here at Watkins Glen. In this day and age, you bring a car to the racetrack, you're bringing a safe automobile. It's still checked over, but in the early days at Smalley's Garage on Franklin Street in Watkins Glen, they checked just about everything from stem to stern to make sure it had been constructed well, as most of them were home-built or modified street cars. And the Smalley family lost Tom Smalley this past winter, and they've just reopened at their location across from Burger King. So we're thrilled that that will continue in the fashion that it's taken part of the vintage event in September. They'll still be having a tech inspection there for that part of the vintage weekend. In the 1940s and 50s, a lot of race drivers around the world were of the opinion they didn't want to be wearing seat belts, as they'd prefer to be thrown clear if there was an accident. And it wasn't popular when the first race here at the Glen had a rule book that mandated safety belts. Most wore a war surplus belt from aircraft, but they did their job. And our next speaker is Randy States, who will be discussing his father, Dr. John States' work on safety devices and designs for competition cars that were pretty groundbreaking ideas in the 1960s. And he has a few slides to show and talk about his dad's work. His father, an award-winning race medical. Thank you. Come on up, Randy.
All right, well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation. Certainly, my father did. He loved it up here, and I know he always loved to, any chance he could, to come back to the track, and also yeah, actually. Okay, how about if I keep it right up close? Okay. All right. Well, I think what really marked the transition from the 50s into the 60s was the idea that some consideration should be given to safety. In the early 1960s, this was my dad's car and pretty much the state of the art for a medical team at the track. Certainly a far cry from what we've got today. I'm going to take some time and just to talk about my father's approach to really accumulating the data, understanding what was going on with the accidents, and how to go about limiting the injuries. And as much as we like to talk about the Formula One races and the big races here, I think he learned as much from the club racing and the amateur racing that really drove what he learned. When you take a look at the cars in the early even before the 1960s, people were running relatively low horsepower. The speeds weren't that great. In the 1960s, with the advent of the Can-Am series, Trans Am, cars like the Shelby Cobras, McLaren's Alolas, performance was really rather just increased exponentially. And even as CCA required use of seatbelts, the injury rates actually dropped down. Injuries were less severe, even though the cars were much more powerful, much faster. And I think my father did much of his work at Watkins Glen largely because of proximity. He lived in Rochester, and he loved it here. I think he also found the support staff, the track workers, and the drivers down here to be all very receptive to what he was doing, and had and wanted to encourage his work. This is the 1961 Formula One race. I'm sure you can see some of the pretty obvious changes in especially trackside safety. Used to be what was called a safety ditch. It was about 4 feet deep, 12 feet across. I believe the role of that was to keep the cars from going far off track and into the spectators. There is very little understanding on the kinematics and the physiology of what happened to bodies during accidents. And also the number, just how close people could get to the track. And the cars weren't a whole lot better. The car, we saw in the 1960s the advent of the Monaco chassis, which were basically sheet metal chassis. I think at least one of the cars had a high content of magnesium in the frame, which burned very hot. There were the injuries resulting out of these accidents were really quite horrific, especially with fuel fires. And I believe there was an accident in I think it was a 1963 Formula One race where Graham Hill was thrown from a car. He got it. He was able afterwards. I think his reaction was something along the line of, "Thank God I didn't have a seatbelt on, or else I would have been really hurt." But he did come away from that with broken legs. And taking a look back, it was the first time that seatbelts came into the first time that I saw the seatbelts being mentioned in the sports car magazines was in 1962. There was an article that made a few comments that, drivers were reluctant to use them. Maybe we should go, in addition to actually requiring that they are in the car, maybe we should check to see if they're using them. And a couple years later, I saw the first mention of roll bar regulations. And these roll bar regulations were really quite simple. It was, even in the guidance that was published, it was this is guidance. We're not going to prescribe what has to be done. They did at least insist that the steel walls of the roll bar are at least 3/16 inch. And there was a couple measurements for the measurements of how much clearance there should be between the roll bar and the helmet. But outside of that, it was pretty much left to the scrutineer to decide whether a roll bar was adequate. There was a little, I think in some place they decided, well, we should be testing this somehow. So they put a hook. If the hook could pick up the car, we called it good. And I think what was really remarkable out of my father's work was his sense of organization and his data collection. And this is long before computers were even somebody's dream. You can see the different categories that he listed things. He would just punch out different pieces and then be able to go back and sort from things like all the accidents at Watkins Glen that involve cars going 100 miles an hour or greater. And, I think it was kind of interesting to see how he developed his categories of, are we talking about club racing, national racing, what type of car? And this data, this is really the meat and potatoes of how he learned to reduce the injury rates. One of the earlier papers that he published was looking at 3 years of data, especially from Watkins Glen. And during those 4 years, he was looking at the types of accidents, the speeds, the level of injury severity, and whether the driver was restrained by lap belt or lap belt and shoulder harness, and also what type of shoulder harness. And during those few years, again, this was 65 through 68. Speeds increased, the lap times decreased, and because of the requirements, there was more use of restraint systems, and the injuries actually became less severe. This article mentioned a couple of case studies. One of them was this Camaro that went off track at 130 miles an hour, hit what was referred to as the safety ditch, and rolled end over end. The driver was able to make his own way out of the car, was conscious, but suffered a concussion. Another accident that he reported, that he detailed, was a Porsche Elva. It's a very small very small car it also hit the ditch and rolled laterally, and actually the bottom of the car wrapped around the tree. And at that point, the driver was killed, and there was very little that any kind of restraints would would help in that accident. But it pointed out that, maybe we shouldn't be having these obstacles so close to the track. That if a car could hit a 24-inch diameter tree 20 something feet away from the track, we've identified something else that we can fit pretty clearly. And this was another type of data card that he maintained. His outside of the racetrack accidents, he would take a look at. I think most of his data came from passenger car accidents, especially around Rochester. This one caught my eye when I saw that, where Clover Hills Drive and Clover Street, that's where we lived. And then Elida States, that was his mother. And he was in the car when she pulled out and got hit by a motorcycle. And looking further into the, I'm kind of flipping through these cards, and I see, look at that, there are two cars with B, with my name up here, or two accident reports with my name, two from my younger sister, one from my older brother. So his this auto safety was personal for him. I think one of the earliest accidents that he summarized like this, and that he referred to often, was from 1959, when a woman was driving a microbus, VW microbus. I think she rear-ended a truck going 20 or 25 miles an hour and fractured both of her legs, broke her hip, disfigured her face. And as an ER doctor, he just realized something's got to change here. We just can't keep letting these kinds of injuries occur. And as he looked at more and more accidents, he would just keep getting further interested in how these injuries developed. At first, there were some pretty obvious things like restrain the driver. That will limit quite a few injuries. And then start looking at even inside the car with the belted driver, where do these injuries come from? Is it a head hitting the steering wheel, a windshield, the dashboard? Is his knees coming up into the dashboard? And he just kept looking further and further into these, and even looking at, well, what kinds of injuries are caused by the seat belts or shoulder harnesses themselves. And that led to some research on how you angle the seat belts, how you mount the seat belts and angle the shoulder harnesses. And he starts looking at the seatbelt webbing. In the SCCA cars, these 3-inch wide aviation belts were pretty common, but auto manufacturers aren't going to go for that. So what type of webbing or what kind of cloth is better suited for production use? And he would even, as I'm looking through his papers, he would look at, how does the cloth degrade in sunlight, and how do you anchor the cloth at the anchorage point to the car frame without making pinch points that cut the seat belts? And then how do you sew the seat belt seam together? It just seems like his interest just kept going and going. And then eventually he went on to looking at the roll bar specifications. How do you test it? Head restraints. He worked with Dr. Hubbard and Jim Downing on the Hans devices. Also, his interest went into the safer barriers, and just what else what else causes impacts. And inside a collision, you have the first collision where the car hits an object, then the driver hits an object inside the car, and even a third collision of what happens to the brain inside the skull. And then all of this was, he was doing this when he had a day job too. You know, he had his own private practice in orthopedic surgery. He went on to teach at University of Rochester, and sometimes I just wonder how he managed to get done what he has done. One area that's, I think, is especially relevant here was he noticed what's called the submarining, where the drivers would kind of slip under the seat belts and go forward inside the cockpit, either hitting the dashboards or if it was a front engine vehicle, sometimes the front engine would move backwards into the driver. And early race cars had some protection, had some of the seats were actually built in to kind of hold the legs up at an angle. And he noticed that there were fewer injuries from race drivers that were belted into these seats that were angled up. And, you know, that kind of look at what's the mechanism that's happening here and how do you restrain the driver. I think the race drivers actually felt they had more literally seat of the pants feel of what the car is doing when they're strapped in and are sitting tightly against the seat that's resisting like that. And Volkswagen was one of the early production cars that actually built in these components to keep the passengers or keep the driver from submarining under the dashboard. And then they went further by designing the dashboard to deflect your legs down so that you wouldn't have a hard impact of your legs against the dashboard, and building the firewalls in the engine compartment to push the engine downward so it wouldn't enter into the passenger compartment. Roll bars were of particular concern. You know, going back, I think there's a 65 Mustang that he used up at the Glen. You can see back in here, he had a roll bar in the car. This was not an option. In the car, you looked at it, it just looked like it was built in. I don't know where he got his craftsmanship, but it was rather remarkable. And he even had a 5/8" camber along the top. I'm not sure why he decided on that, but he did. So it's really rather remarkable that he could think of this, sketch it out on a piece of paper, and then get it built. Sometimes you wonder about his judgment on his safety. This is a chopped VW that we turned into a dune buggy. You can see there is a roll bar back here with the driver and 13 passengers. And the first iteration, the roll bar was actually just in place to carry the surfboard. And I think my dad was one of the first people on the East Coast to have a fiberglass Hobie surfboard too. Later on, he built it up to be a full roll cage. The roll cage came into effect after he learned that my brother and I had to push this car back on its wheels when we had managed to get it up on its side. And, this is another one where I just wonder about his judgment sometimes, where, what could two teenage boys use better than a lightweight car with a high-performance engine? So moving into the 1970s, you can see there, at least especially on the track side, there was more consideration on the injury prevention. That all the way around the circuit, we've got two. I think now it's 3 levels of railing of guardrail that to prevent some of these. I think some of the most horrific accidents where a car actually went under the guardrail, and in one case the driver was decapitated. And the trackside features have greatly improved, and that, you know, over the 1970s relative to the 1960s, we at least got rid of the so-called safety ditches along the side. There was some consideration for runoff area, but it's, you know, certainly a far cry from what's considered standard practice now. Even in the 1970s, we're still allowing some people to lean on the guardrail to get a good photo. And I put this in here just to, you know, a sense of just how much he loved to be down here. This is my older brother. I think it was either this car or the next station wagon after this car that when we were down in Florida with the car top carrier and a trailer, we took a lap on the just built Daytona track. And you know, his work is really came about because of how many people were encouraging him and supporting him while he was at this track and in so many others. So that, I'd like to wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randy, for sharing your father's story with us. With the one of the major concerns in motorsports through the years has been fire, but with the advent of the rubber-based bladders filled with foam enclosed in the steel containers, that threat was minimized. Both Goodyear and Firestone, with insistence from NASCAR and Indianapolis Motor Speedway, created the technology that allowed this advance to happen in the mid to late 60s. In safety gear for drivers and crews, the Nomex fabric, developed by DuPont, and later a similar fabric called Durette that Monsanto produced, were revolutionary. The early coveralls drivers wore were pretty much just cotton overalls soaked in borax. Today, drivers wear multiple layer suits to protect themselves. And the advance in helmet design from the early two. You've seen that movie with Brad Pitt wearing a tanker helmet. He said it saved his life after he crashed. But later that year, he was again without a helmet competing in Europe. Here in the U.S., helmets became a requirement, but it wasn't until 1952 that Grand Prix racing made it a rule. Here in the U.S., the Snell Foundation, named for driver Pete Snell, who died in a crash on the West Coast, was started in 1956 and continues to this day to research the best in protective headgear for motorsports and industrial use. In my research on the topic, I came across an article from the 50s that helmets and roll bars, it was discussed that drivers should be prepared to duck if they thought there was going to be an accident coming. When we are through here this afternoon, I hope you'll take the time to look at a wonderful collection of helmets that Gary Morgan has brought to share with us for this program today. There's a couple of Hans devices also that Randy mentioned a minute ago over there on display. The head and neck restraint developed by Dr. Robert Hubbard, a biomechanical engineer from Michigan State, who's the brother-in-law of race driver Jim Downing. The concept was in response to a death of a friend of theirs in a test crash. The prototype was created in '85, and by '89, they had enough data to show that it cut force to the head and neck by 80%, but there wasn't a safety company that made driver equipment that was interested in that product. By '89, they had enough data, but they decided to go ahead and market it themselves. Some were sold in the '90s, but wide acceptance of the product didn't come until the early 2000s. It was tested by Mercedes, and they saw the merit in it, and the world sanctioning body, the FIA, got behind the product for international racing. It specifically works to limit the basal skull fractures, and I'm sure our next couple of presenters will have comments on the Hans device. Our next presenter is Mike Semmel, an Elmira native with a love of auto racing and training as a volunteer firefighter who was also a young SCCA member, and he became part of the fire response team as a young man, going on to head safety services at Watkins Glen, and also was a member of the CART safety team. Mike has responded to many accident scenes, some of which knowledge of the construction of the car and its systems is something that wasn't really a concern decades ago, but it certainly is in this day and age. Mike, welcome.
Thanks, Rick. Ron, is this mic on? Yeah, Thanks, everybody, for coming out on a lovely Saturday afternoon. What prepares you for this? And when you think of the word you have to think about a lot of different people that are involved. Before I get started, Rick talked a little bit about my background. I started out here in 1971 at the Glen, 14 years old, working in tech. And my dad had gotten me the job through a friend of his, and because I was too young to touch a race car, I had to inspect the driver's equipment for those Snell stickers and the labels on the back to make sure that they met the international standards. I'm 14 years old. I've got my own little office in the tech center, and I looked up, and there's Graham Hill, Mario Andretti, and Jackie Stewart all in line with their bags for me to inspect their stuff. That was a great introduction to auto racing. I worked for Tech, then I went on to the safety team here, became what they called the Grand Prix, U.S. Grand Prix Fire Chief. I drove the chase vehicle at 2 Formula One races at the beginning of the race. And then in started working for CART in 1980 and then doubled with the Watkins Glen International until I couldn't do like 40 weekends a year in racing. And I went with CART and did 19 years on the IndyCar rescue team. Family business in Elmira was Chemung Electronics and Chemung Computer, for those of you that remember those organizations. I've made a lot of friends in racing. This goes back to about 81 or 82 at Pocono when I started. Made a lot of friends in racing. Consider Mario to be a very good friend, Michael, the whole family. Couldn't do a racing presentation without bringing Linda Vaughn into this. So many of you will remember Linda from the races. And then Dario Franchidio I'm going to talk about a little bit today when we talk about concussions. These are two guys who are both friends of mine and also mentors. I was privileged to start working with Steve Olvey in 1980. Steve is a brain injury expert. He's the head of the Neurosciences Intensive Care Unit, Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami, the University of Miami Hospital. Terry Trammell, who you may know, is the orthopedist who put back together many drivers. And back in the 80s, there were a lot of injuries with broken legs. And Terry put Humpty Dumpty back together and let him race again. So when we look at racing safety, we have to look at these different areas. The first one, of course, are the cars. Then we have the drivers themselves. Safety equipment, a safety system. Dr. Norton was talking about, these ambulances parked on corners. That was the safety system back in the 50s. It's evolved over the years. I think many of you know that. And then finally, the tracks themselves. I'm not going to talk about the tracks because we've got R.J. Valentine here who can do that much better than I can. But let's look at the cars. These are a couple pictures of Dan Gurney. And I know that you just saw in Randy's presentation that there were some requirements for the head to be a certain distance below the roll bar. Dan Gurney was born about 6 foot, well, he wasn't born 6'4", but Dan was big. And if you ever look at a Ford GT and you see the little bubble in the roof, that was because Dan couldn't fit in that car with his helmet on. But look at this. And I want you to look at two things. He was unsafe from head to toe, literally. Look at where his head is in relation to the roll bar. Now look at the bottom picture. Look at where his feet are. This is why so many people got hurt. Stan Fox, Danny Ungaius, 1981. Here are the features that are built into the cars today. First of all, they've reduced the amount of fuel, and they have gone with methanol instead of gasoline. Those first two pictures, believe it or not, were cars that had methanol as fuel, but that was the oil that was exploding out of the engine block during the impact. It was not the fuel exploding. When you look at these safety features, you've got deformable structures on the side of the car. It's actually like foam that will collapse and reduce the amount of impact on the driver. There's a safety cell, so the impact goes around the driver wherever possible. They widened the cockpits. This came from us on the safety team and how difficult it was to extricate drivers when there weren't rules that said how wide the cockpit had to be. So these drivers were sitting completely surrounded, and then we'd get to them and we'd have to kind of wrestle them out of the car. So in the newer design, this DW12, you can see that the cockpit is bigger. And then they put some features in which some people didn't like. There are purists in racing who don't like anything around the wheels, but the idea was so the cars wouldn't interlock wheels so that they would jump over each other. The drivers have to be in good physical shape. I think it's safe to say Danica's in pretty good physical shape. But what you may not know are that Scott Dixon and Tony Kanaan do triathlons. And in racing, you have to be in fantastic shape for two reasons. One is an Indy car doesn't have power steering. And when you think of wrestling that car around a road course or a street course in particular for a few hours, it's a huge amount of work. The second thing is the load on the necks and the stress on the body. You've got to be in really good shape. You have to take care of yourself and be hydrated. This is a big thing. And safety seminars that I've gone to have talked a lot about drivers who have become dehydrated. Here at the Glen, in one of the IMSA races, I was in the pit lane. Actually, I came into Victory Circle when Derek Bell was bringing Al Holbert's Porsche in after winning the race. And Derek had no idea who he was, where he was, or what the hell he was doing. And we got him out of the car. There are pictures of me sitting with him on the steps to Victory Lane while Al's being interviewed. And we ended up putting him in an ambulance, taking him over to Race Medical. And about 7:30 that night, he kind of woke up. And it was all from dehydration. And finally, concussions. And concussions have been controversial. And we now know that a lot of that is because the NFL wanted to keep concussion data and concussion information pretty secret because it was their dirty secret. And right now, there are a lot of guys in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who are in nursing homes because of concussions. So when we talk about hydration, there's actually a chart here that drivers can use, and I've seen this put up in restrooms in pit lanes or in garage areas where the drivers can just literally compare the color of their urine to the sample to see if they're hydrated enough. It's really that simple. Drink enough to pee clear. When we talk about concussions, Randy mentioned this, that impact of the brain to the skull. It's the brain moving within the skull that's a concussion. It's hitting the front, the back, or the side of the inside of your skull. What that means is that helmets really don't do much to protect from concussions. In fact, a heavier helmet can cause a greater concussion. With concussions, the driver does not need to have been unconscious. They don't need to have a direct hit on their head. It can be an acceleration or a deceleration concussion. They don't have to have lost their memory. They may or may not have post-concussion symptoms, and if they have those symptoms, it may not be a concussion. There may be other causes. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then this is really important. Repeated subclinical head accelerations will likely become part of the definition of concussions. They have been. Subclinical means that it doesn't have to be a full-blown concussion, just repeated impacts of the brain at a lower speed in the head. And I went to a safety seminar this year, and one of the drag racers was talking about the Hans device. And he said that since the Hans device was mandated, his Mondays have been different because his Mondays are no longer spent clearing his head and getting his neck to feel better. And that was all related, not to hits, but to the huge acceleration of those cars off the line. And then when he pulls the lever for the chutes, the huge deceleration. And this is something where they're looking now, and they're even seeing kids playing high school football games who are doing just normal hits, not concussion level hits. But as Steve Olvey once showed me in a restaurant, you take the salt shaker and just start tapping it. You don't have to whack it hard. Just start tapping it, and over time that salt will settle. That's what happens to the brain with CTE. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a concussion expert, but I can understand a salt shaker. And I'm just telling you, when you start looking at this, and you look at people in racing, and you look at kids playing football, you have a whole different view of what they should and shouldn't be doing, because it doesn't have to be a massive hit to cause a concussion. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, but driver safety equipment has evolved over the years, and we went from needing to be fireproof now to needing to be fireproof but also breathe so that the driver doesn't become overheated in the suit. And with helmets, the helmet technology has changed a great deal. So helmets are now really light. Again, it's counterintuitive. Race car drivers driving at huge speeds, you would think the heavier the helmet, the more protection they would have. It's the opposite. The more weight they have on their head, the worse it is on their neck muscles and their shoulders. And when they have a hit, now they've got, if they have a heavier helmet, think of it as a pendulum swinging. They're going to have more weight that is swinging their head, and that's more likely to cause an injury or a concussion. When you look at the material, think of plywood with different plies of the carbon fiber and the materials going over each other, so they're very thin, but they're very, very strong. A helmet's designed to prevent an impact, not to prevent a concussion. And this says that the helmet itself can inflict injury. And also, there's no such thing as a concussion-proof helmet. You have to look at that in relation to other things. Here's a quick comparison of racing helmets to football helmets, state-of-the-art football helmets. A racing helmet now is 2.2 pounds, 1 kilogram, including the radio. A football helmet's twice that. A racing helmet has all these multiple layers. It's custom fitted to the individual, and it's had all sorts of tests through Snell, and then there's an FIA certification called 8860, where you have to take a Snell Foundation helmet and then put it to further tests. You look at a football helmet, it's basically to protect you from a force that would cause a skull fracture in a cadaver head. It's not designed to protect against what most hits are in football. And the weight is high, and there are 3 sizes, small, medium, and large. This is just a comparison. When you look at these guys, and by the way, our asses were on television an awful lot of the time. When you look at these guys, what are they doing? Anybody tell me? Trying to get the helmet off. What happens when you try to get a helmet off? You unstrap it, and you're kind of wiggling it and pulling on the driver's head. A company called Stand 21 that makes safety equipment came up with this. This is not rocket science, folks. $129 retail. It's a balaclava with this strap across it, and all the rescue people have to do is pull on both sides of the strap, and the helmet lifts off. They call it a lid lifter. This is not high tech, but somebody was thinking, like Randy's dad would have looked at this. I'm surprised, Randy, maybe you should have come up with it based on all of the way that he thought about things. But you look at this, and this is so simple, and there are now sanctioning bodies that are requiring this in different areas of racing. When I worked here at the Glen, we kind of thought we had a system. And I say that because in 1980, I learned an awful lot from CART. And I'll also tell you, it wasn't a good start because they kind of stepped on our toes, and they came in and told us that they were taking charge of the racetrack. We had been doing Formula One racing, and here these guys are from IndyCar telling us, you know, we're not going to be the first out on an accident. But they had a concept that I learned to believe in, still believe in, which is a system. And you look at this and you see a safety truck, but what's behind it? That was the tractor trailer medical center that CART brought to all the races. Full-blown emergency room. You could do surgery in that. And the reason for it was that a lot of our tracks didn't have high quality medical facilities. Some of them were temporary road circuits where there were no medical facilities at the circuit. You'd have to drive down the road to a hospital someplace. But this got me going on what needed to be a full integrated system. When you see the truck pull up, you've probably seen this in IndyCar racing, but do you know all the components that you're looking at here? So there are fire extinguishers on the corners of the trucks. First thing the guys can grab when they come around the corner. Fluid management, otherwise known as speedy dry, in these big buckets, because the idea, don't forget that we're on television. What was the first thing that they were telling us as we were pulling up? We hadn't even gotten out of the truck yet. Mike, give me a time estimate for TV. We hadn't even gotten there, and they want to know how fast they can get back to television and full-blown racing. There's now a jack on the back of the truck. We didn't even have these when we started out. Now, we used to have to turn cars around by hand and do K-turns and all that. Now they go under, pull the jack, spin the car around, and push start it to get out. Or, if they can't push start it, sorry, those are the Holmatro rescue tools, which are like the Hearst Jaws of life. Holmatro is a rescue tool company, but they now have a starter for the IndyCar. So you know at the beginning of an IndyCar race, they push the starter into the back of the car and start it. Now the safety trucks have it, so if a car gets stalled on the circuit, they can start it. You know what we had to do when we started? Push start them and have the driver pop the clutch. We're in a 3-layer suit in 100-degree weather at Burke Lakefront Airport in Cleveland, and they don't put trees for shade on airports. It was terrible. And then there's a firefighting system. And the firefighting system is actually, much more than a fire extinguisher, but if you have something big, you're going to use the firefighting system. It was surprising how seldom that was needed because the fuel cells worked. We had brake fires, we had some oil fires and things like that. Most of the time the fires were put out with extinguishers. This is something that's really hard to see in an IndyCar for obvious reasons. You have to be looking down on it. But what the helmet hit was the side of the car in most accidents, or the back behind the driver. So now they have this cushion, this head restraint around the driver. It pops right out so that the drivers can get in and out of the car easily. But this has limited the helmet movement, so you don't see the number of concussions that we've had in the past. I don't know if you know this, that when an IndyCar driver is putting his earplugs in, it's not just for his radio. They have accelerometers in the earplugs. What we found when we got to wrecks, and even on the street when I was a rescue captain in the West Elmira Fire Department, we would pull people out and they'd be barefoot or just wearing socks. And somebody would say, were they driving barefoot? We'd look back in the car and find their shoes. You don't realize how flexible the human body is. And in a high impact, you can literally get popped or sucked up out of your shoes. So when they were looking at how to measure the impact on the drivers, they figured out that the earplugs never came out. So they put accelerometers in there. There's still earplugs that they use to hear their radios, but there are accelerometers in there. That's an enlarged picture of one. Also accelerometers in the car. Goes back to what Randy's dad was doing, collecting data. IndyCar has tons of data about the angle of the hit, the G-force of the hit, whether it's multiple cars or impact into a stationary object like a wall. But they've collected a ton of data and they use that. Did anyone see this week? This is a press release out of Indianapolis 2 days ago. And that's why when you do a presentation like this, you never know what it's really going to end up like, because I didn't have this information. IndyCar mandates this iPass test to evaluate concussions. Anybody have a virtual reality headset? This looks like one. It's hooked up to a laptop computer, and what it does is it measures eye movement. And here's the thing. How many times has a driver gotten out of the car with his bell rung, and we'd run up to him and say, how you doing? He'd say, I'm doing great, feel great. Let me get back to the pits. I got to get into my backup car. Or I'm heading out of here. I'm going to head back to the hotel. They were lying to us every time. They weren't great. I remember Scott Brayton down at Nazareth, who was like trying to order a pizza or something when I was talking to him at the side of the racetrack. Had no idea where he was, but he was telling me that he was okay. And this test now measures eye movement, and this is the test that at St. Petersburg last year, 2016, Will Power had a big hit, and he wasn't feeling well. and they thought it was a concussion, and he went to Miami to see Steve Olvey, and Steve ran tests on him, and they figured out it wasn't a concussion. It was an inner ear infection that caused him to lose his balance and not feel right and be woozy. And the reason that this iPass is so important is that it does diagnose concussions, but it also diagnoses when you don't have one. And the reason that's so important is that if you have a concussion, and now these sanctioning bodies have concussion protocols, you're going to be out of the car for a while. But in Will's case, as soon as his inner ear infection cleared up, they let him race again. So this is the type of device. This is now something you can carry, a doctor can carry in a bag with a laptop computer and use it portably at a racetrack. Hopefully, eventually, I think you'll start seeing these things at high school football games. Vegas 2011. I was there, and I'm retired. I don't work on the safety team anymore. I was there with friends, got a ticket for a friend up in the grandstand. I've never watched a race from the grandstand, actually maybe twice in my life. And I said to him, I'll meet you in the grandstand, I'll watch the beginning of the race, and then I'll head down to the pit lane. So I was taking pictures, and if you look down here in the lower right corner, you'll see why. You can see sparks coming off the car. The cars were full of fuel. They were running at, racing speeds. This was just second or third lap. And this shows up in my viewfinder. That's Will Power. The upper left is Dan Weldon at the moment he was killed, when he hit the wall. Look at Will's car. About 30 feet up in the air. You may remember that wreck. This is the part that hurts. Because the race drivers know what they're getting into. But he left his family behind. I was at Pocono. I had lunch with Justin Wilson on Saturday at the Andretti Hospitality area. This is Sunday. So this is Zach, who had hit the wall. Justin's over here. The nose of the car took what we call the unluckiest bounce in the history of racing. And it landed on his head and it killed him. Justin with his family. So now IndyCar decided they had to do something to prevent this kind of impact. So they needed a windscreen. Where did they go to look for a windscreen? Indy cars run 200 miles an hour. Fighter jets are 600 miles an hour, 800 miles an hour, whatever. And they looked at the canopies and said, these are clear. The pilot can see out of them in all directions, doesn't have obstructions, doesn't have, the material is such that it doesn't create, as long as it's well made, it doesn't create any optical illusions or anything. So they took they were looking at this, and PPG Industries came to them. Now, PPG is a paint company, but they have a glass division, and PPG was the sponsor of IndyCar racing for years. They're still back in now as a car sponsor. So they looked at this, and that's Terry Trammell and Jeff Horton. That's actually a cut-down fighter jet canopy, that they've turned into a windscreen. This is Gabby Chavez, the IndyCar driver, sitting in the car as they were measuring it. So what they did was they took this windscreen idea, and the first thing they did was what? They didn't put him out on the track. They put Gabby in the Dallara simulator in Indianapolis with a windscreen on, and they ran different tracks. They ran Watkins Glen as one of the tracks because of the guardrail down the walls. And there was one track that he had some issues with, and it turned out when they looked at the windscreen itself, there was a little deformity in the plastic. This is a plastic material, and that it wasn't the track itself. It was when he was looking for the apex points, he was hitting that deformity. So they got a different canopy, cut it down, ran it again, and then it was okay. Here's Scott Dixon testing the canopy at Phoenix. Now look at this. You can barely see that it's there in that frontal picture. It's clear. When they first started with this, they thought they were just going to put the windscreen in front of the driver because they're looking for frontal protection. And then when the drivers were looking through that and then at their mirrors, their eyes were refocusing. We don't realize it. Even looking through what we think is a clear windshield is not exactly the same as looking at something without the glass in front of us. So what was happening is that his eyes were focusing just a little bit different. This was Gabby in the simulator. And they realized they had to wrap the windscreen around. So the driver, when he's looking forward and then looks at his mirrors, isn't looking through glass and then not through glass. So that's why this wrapped. And you can see the mirror still in its usual place on the car. This is the Formula One halo. Look at that contraption compared to this IndyCar windscreen. And the Formula One halo was designed for exactly the same thing, to prevent the frontal impact. The one thing I'll tell you is that the IndyCar folks, Formula One, and the other big sanctioning bodies are all part of an international safety consortium, and IndyCar has shared all of its material, all of its information with Formula One, and Formula One still came into this. I have experience with all these racing sanctioning bodies, and I will tell you that one of the issues that we saw with many of them is what I call the NIH syndrome. Not invented here. If they didn't think of it, it wasn't a good idea. I look at this, and just logic tells me that that IndyCar windscreen seems to be a better solution than the Formula One. To be honest, I don't care what it is if it protects the driver from getting hit by something like Sage Karam's windscreen. After an accident of any kind, whether it's an injury or a fatal, there's recovery for people. And this is something that you don't see typically when you're involved in racing, because sometimes it happens days later. And this brings me to what I call the hidden safety team. And the hidden safety team is a part of the system that you don't normally see at the races. So this is a picture of Alex Zanardi in 2001, September 2001, at the Lautzen Ring in Germany. This race was the weekend after 9/11. Some of our drivers had to get special permission to fly. Remember, there were no planes flying after 9/11, so that they could get to Europe for this race. Alex was leading the race, came out of the pits too hot, spun his tires because they were cold, slid up, and Alex Tagliani T-boned him and cut his legs off. Terry Trammell was on the rescue truck, pulls up next to Alex's car, jumps out, thinks he's in oil. It wasn't oil, it was blood. Gets to the car, and Alex's legs are off. Terry looks down, sees his legs bleeding, took his gloves off and stuffed his thumbs up into his femoral arteries to keep Alex from bleeding to death. They get Alex to the medical center. Here's where he's being put in on the gurney going into the helicopter. You can see Alex's that's his head right there, and that's his nose pointed straight up with Steve Olvey next to him. What else do you see in this picture? One of my all-time best friends, Father Phil DeRay, who we sadly lost last year, is right there. And Steve Olvey thinks that Father Phil had as much to do with Alex surviving as Terry putting his thumbs in his arteries, because there's no explanation for how Alex survived that day. After they put Alex in the helicopter, Steve ran back into Race Medical to look at Tag, Alex Tagliani, because he had been the other car in the accident. Tag was doing okay. Steve heard this noise, couldn't figure out what it was, went outside 5 minutes later, and the helicopter was still on the ground. And Steve ran up to the pilot and used the only words in German he knew, which were schnell, schnell, schnell. Fast, fast, fast. And that's when the helicopter took off. So Alex lost his legs on the track, lost like 45% of his blood supply. Terry sticks his thumbs in his legs to keep him alive. The helicopter pilot, for who knows what reason, just sat there and didn't transport him. Alex is alive today. And Alex has the greatest personality, the greatest outlook on life, and is now going to be racing again, even though he has no legs. He's been racing in the Special Olympics or the Disabled Olympics, whatever they call that, with his wheelchair and doing all sorts of other things. But Father Phil is a big part of this. We're fortunate today to have John Gorsline here. If you ask John what he does for a living, he says he sells insurance. He and I disagree on that. Because when I look at what John has done for racing, first of all, he has helped young racers. There's a young woman here named Danica Patrick who is retiring this week. John, does that make you feel old? What year did Danica win your scholarship? Long time ago when she was just starting out. And, I'm sorry? Danica was 15, and she's retiring next week after the Indy 500. But I tell John he's in the family assistance business. John shows up at the races. He talks to the race car drivers. This is a picture of Ricky Taylor and his mom, Shelley. And what I'm going to tell you about the hidden safety system is that if something happens to Ricky, John's going to be there for Shelley. And some of the things that John has done is helped families fly in when their children have been injured or worse to be with the family or with their family member. He's helped transport people because race car drivers don't always race close to home. And after they're recovered or stabilized, they got to get back home. Now, the insurance is an important part of it because it covers costs. But family assistance is something you really don't see unless you've been around racing for a while and you know what happens after a driver has been here in the hospital. And Brandy mentioned Graham Hill. It was actually 1969 that Graham Hill was injured and spent like a week at Arnott Ogden in the hospital there and was operated on by Dr. Silicano in Elmira, and they became great friends. But that's how you start seeing how the family reacts and what happens to them. And the drivers make this decision to go out in the car and do something risky. They don't always realize what the impact is on their families if they get hurt. And then finally, I mentioned Stand 21 earlier. They're the ones that came up with this, the lid lifter, which again, not high tech, but it really solves a big problem. They do a safety seminar every year. It's free. It's open to the public. When I say it's open to the public, you have to have a ticket to the Long Beach Grand Prix because it's in the Grand Prix. They also do something at the SCORE off-road event, PRI race car show, and I think one or two others. Yves Morza is the founder of Stand 21 and believes that safety is more than just selling rescue equipment. So he has speakers. This is the lineup of speakers from this year. We had Oriol Servia, who's an IndyCar driver. He's driving for Bobby Rahal this week. Johnny Lundberg, and I didn't recognize that name. He's a drag racer. Anybody see the wreck with John Force recently where the funny car came apart, went across the drag strip and hooked the other car? Johnny Lundberg was in the other car. He was telling us what it was like to be in that. When was the last time you saw two drag racers actually hit each other? Jacques Dallaire talked about the psychology of racing and things like that, how drivers need to prepare themselves. And then Julia Daly talked about concussion. Steve Olvey was supposed to be there and couldn't. But this is something, if you ever have the opportunity, first of all, Long Beach is a great place to go. It's a festival as much as it is a race, but any one of you can come to this event for free. And finally, if you go out to Amazon Prime, anybody here have Amazon Prime? There's a video called Yellow, Yellow, Yellow about the IndyCar safety team. There's another one called The Quick and the Dead. You'll see Jackie Stewart's picture on it. He was quick, he's not dead. But that has interviews with Francois Sever, Peter Revson, and a lot of others back when the drivers were being hurt and killed. There's also on YouTube a video called The Crashes That Changed Racing. And this is good, this is free, anybody that has YouTube. And then there are a couple of books that you want to look at. One is Rapid Response by Steve Olvey. Now when I saw Steve recently, he said they're going to turn it into a movie. It's written by Steve Olvey, and now Alex Zanardi, and the second edition has written a part of it. And then there are several books by Sid Watkins, who was the Formula One physician who came here to the Glen and traveled the circuit. And this is all information if you want to get more. So thank you. It's been a privilege to talk to you. And I appreciate the invitation to come here to the Research Center. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, we saw each other first. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Mike. I'd like to take just a minute and remember one of the 2018 SCCA Hall of Fame inductees who was a part of the Glen region. Bill Bradshaw passed away this last year. He'd been in the Sports Car Club of America since 1964. I'd like to read just a bit of the statement that was used to induct him into the Hall of Fame. His incredible gifts of time and effort across multiple programs benefited generations and will continue to help others for decades to come. He was a competitor in road rally, stage rally, and road racing, but found his calling helping other members tirelessly working trackside, staging rallies, and in board meetings shaping the organization. Through the years, Bradshaw helped inspecting tracks as a pit marshal, directing traffic on the grid, or as a steward, including time spent as executive steward of the Northeast Division and the assistant chief steward for the runoffs at Road Atlanta and Road America. Although his hours spent organizing and volunteering were formidable, it's his efforts for safety that Bradshaw may have the most lasting impact. As a steward, he focused on driver safety by gathering statistics on incidents, analyzing that data on incidents and outcomes, and using them to create risk management profiles. This data and analysis methods helped form the current safety steward model that's still instrumental today. And Bill Bradshaw's commitment to safety also extended into supporting and promoting the recognition of emergency services in SCCA as a separate, unique specialty, an effort that resulted in the creation of a standalone license for emergency services in the SCCA organization. So I just wanted to remember Bill Bradshaw.
County Commissioner joke.
No, I'm not going to tell that joke, no. Thanks, Mike. We've talked about helmets, seat belts, Hans devices, accident scenes, and rescues, and now our final speaker will discuss the barriers that surround racetracks. Over his 40 years behind the wheel, R.J. Valentine has raced nearly every type of car on circuits all over the world. He's a regular visitor to Victory Lane and a winner in the business world as well, operating many successful companies, including racetracks and the Impact Safety Systems, which is the barrier alternative to guardrails and to concrete walls. The technology has come a long way from the hay bale. I'd like you to please welcome R.J. Valentine.
Thank you. You can pull around. First of all, happy to be here. I've always enjoyed coming to the Glen, not only for the racetrack, for the great people and the great scenery up here. Probably have raced here at least 26 or 28 times, the last count, and have raced at multiple tracks throughout the United States, Canada, Mexico, and some in Europe. And through the years, what I've observed is in most of the racetracks, just about every single racetrack, the technology has effectively stayed the same. It's either concrete barriers, Armco barriers, the ones you see on highways, or tire stacks. You say to yourself, okay, well, is that ever going to change? I mean, some of the pictures that you've seen here up on the screen where you're seeing cars that have hit walls, have been destroyed, caught on fire. When you look at the relative weight of, say, a Jersey barrier or a wall, whether it be concrete or steel, in the case of a concrete wall, they weigh about 11,000 pounds. The shorter ones weigh about 6,000 pounds. Now, the vehicles that you see here, whether they're open wheel or closed wheel, are in the range of anywhere from 1,800 pounds to 26, and NASCAR Grand National stock cars up around 3,400 pounds. So at a direct hit, what happens? Who wins? Well, it's not going to be the car, I can tell you that. And the end result is either a very, very damaged vehicle with an individual human being in there that's being, you saw the concussion hit. It's beyond belief how some of them are able to recover from them. Back in the early 70s, before that, there weren't any Armco barriers, there weren't cement barriers, there wasn't anything. There was just cars would go off into the woods. They hit trees and go into earth banks or just plain hit something. And then an individual by the name of Jackie Stewart, and he was raised here at the Glen many, many times, started a movement. They were called the Killing Years. As he said, he lost 57 friends in racing. And what that meant, what meant they were fatals. Concussions weren't as high profile as they used to be, as they are now back then. So he was castigated. He was looked at by the owners of the tracks in the series as a debilitating force, until finally the drivers got around and they realized that it was their life on the line, and they got behind him and they started backing Jackie Stewart. That's when you saw Armco in concrete, because there wasn't anything else. So along comes safety in vehicles. These vehicles that you see today are state of the art. As Mike said a little bit earlier, everything that supports the vehicle itself, the people around the vehicle, the doctors, and what have you. But what we're going to get at is the final resting point. All of this is great stuff, but when you hit something, it's one of those three things. So in 1986, when I was driving, I saw my first fatal. Paul Newman had a co-driver by the name of Fitzgerald. And Fitzy hit the wall. I was 3 cars behind him, and I saw him go sideways into a concrete wall at St. Petersburg. He was instantly killed. And it always embedded in my mind that concrete wall was the enemy. And I watched successive injuries, accidents, concussions over the years. So in 2000, I built a go-kart track with a smaller barrier than what you see here. And then I decided we're going to step up to the plate. And when you look at these barriers here, this barrier here is 73 pounds. You can move it pretty easily. Okay, it's got a pin system that drops in. Let's assume that in 70% of the cases, well, let's say 90% of the cases, we fill that up to here with 300 pounds of water. That's how much water going up to here will make that 300 pounds. So what happens is, and I'm going to show you in a moment some photographs, is when a vehicle hits any one or two barriers, what happens, this pin conclusively pulls all the other barriers along. And what it does, it multiplies the number of pounds that are being contracted, or not contracted, but are being pushed. So this barrier really, when it gets hit, it moves. Like, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it works. We've seen it work. Vehicles that would have been total wrecks walk away with dents in them. Now, our new technology is a foam barrier. Okay, you can come up here later and put your hand in, you'll see what it feels like. It'll compress down probably half to even more. Then what we do is we put multiple barriers in, which are 3 deep. Can you all see the screen or no? Let's see. Thank you. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to go directly over to the photo gallery. Okay. This is a track in California called Thermal. That's a skid pad with the smaller barriers. Those are called the KISS barriers, used in go-karts and gymkhanas, autocrosses. Now this is the barriers set up. Here's the principle. If a vehicle hits the barrier, there's about anywhere from 10 to 20 feet and even up to 30 feet on high-speed turns, so that the barrier moves with the vehicle. believe you see enough of that. I'm going to just show you one other track here, I think. Be helpful to see. That's the end of a long straightaway. That straightaway you just saw is double barriers, then Armco, then fencing. Now, that's about a 160-mile-an-hour turn. Certainly, I don't think any of them hit it at 160, but they've gone off. They've never made it to the Armco barrier. The absorption is much less, let's call it intrusionary for a better word. It just moves with the vehicle. This is a particularly good turn because you can see the concrete behind it. This is a slower speed turn. It's about a 50-mile-an-hour turn. You can see the bulging of the barriers a little bit. They've moved. They have yet to touch the wall of the Armco barrier. So for all intents and purposes, there are multiple uses for the barriers. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about why tracks don't use them, okay? And it's like the old story about people are resistant to change. And you talk to some of the track owners and they say, well, why do we need this? Well, if you can't grasp the idea that you're going to hit something very hard and possibly kill somebody and maim them or wreck the car, then there's not a lot I can convince them to say. But it's a continuing story. The other thing is lack of funds. And that's certainly a consideration. The reality of it all is that in terms of lack of funds, everybody in the business thinks that you have to ring a whole track with these barriers. Now, certainly Thermal did a lot of it, but you don't have to do that. What we're most sensitive about is the specific turns that have multiple and ongoing incidents, whether they're injuries at those flipped over, crashes. We've got statistics at some tracks there will be multiple fatals, and you say to the people who are running a track, the multiple fatals here, how can we help you? Sometimes they get a blank stare, sometimes they don't want to talk, but it's an ongoing thing. And there's an old statement, and I believe it's very appropriate here. First, it's ridiculed. Secondly, it's violently opposed. Third, is accepted as being self-evident. So to create change in anything that goes on in life, okay, I see faces like myself here. We all remember the telephone booth. Who the heck ever thought after the telephone booth on a mobile run somewhere that you were going to be using something like this? Things change. In my latter years, as my runway gets shorter, I say to myself, I want to help with a subject that I think is very sensitive. It's very, to me, it's a passion. Okay, so our mission is to make racing safer, bring folks in that understand, as we do, what the problems are, and we've created an alliance. I'm certainly getting people who are resistant to what I'm doing, okay, because they don't want change. So we put together an alliance of many drivers. We've got about 70 drivers, some very prominent ones that are on board to help. Certainly working with these organizations, such as the organization that's sponsoring this today, we want to make sure everybody knows what's going on. The potential for funding options is something that I'm passionate about. And one of the things that you'll see in the kit here is we have a barrier set up where we can take this barrier, and the pin that you saw there can be double the size of it, and you create a banner. And then what you do is you advertise for whoever it is that might like to advertise, which amortizes the cost of the barrier. And sometimes they end up paying nothing. We also have a comparison here of the cost of tire barriers, Armco, and tire stacks, and we come out cheaper. So people will say, well, that's an expensive barrier. We'll say, well, have you taken all the cost of labor? One of the big things that you'll see Mike mentioned it, is when can we get back on the air? Okay, it's dollars and cents. Sponsors want to get back on the air. They don't want to, they'll see the accident, then the accident will get over, and they have to clean it up. In the case of tire barriers or Armco, they have to replace it. Sometimes it takes 2 hours. Okay, the battery going dead? Anyways, the long and short of it is you create a circumstance where you try to cost effectively make the barriers palatable. And when you go into the site, one of the things that you'll see where that says download free absorption? That's this 58-page dissertation on comparisons that are done with a lot of specificity. You'll see things that are analyzed here, the creation of who else is doing this. For those of you that are around racing, we've all heard about the safety walls in NASCAR, which have been fairly effective. But now I'm hearing from people that they want an even softer wall. I don't know if I'll be the company that'll do it, but they do have to create something where a car hitting is going to it makes them absorb. Let me just say this: over 100, over 140, 150 miles an hour. I got to tell you something. I just don't know what happens. It's like a plane crash. There's probably nothing, even my barrier, that'll save somebody. But a lot of accidents are below that, and the creation is that that energy has got to be absorbed. It's a dangerous sport. We all know that. We just have to continue to work for it. So we do track safety analysis all the time. We go into tracks and say to people, a lot of them know where the accidents are. I would just say, well, come in. We'll just show you what we'll do and how I'll use our barriers. Some of them will want to do that. Others will say, if it's not made here, as Mike said, then we don't want it. We don't want to hear about it. So in closing, what I've done is I've talked about a lot of things here, but I've put together some material for you to take with you. I've taken photographs. I've got brochures and articles and what our mission statement is. And if any of you are interested, they're up here. Just come up and grab one, and I'll be sticking around if anybody has any questions after the seminar. But thank you very much for taking the time today.
Thank you very much, RJ. I'd like our speakers to come up. We've got some chairs we're going to pull out here, and we'll do some question and answer. And Josh, if we can bring up the house lights on the front of the stage, please. Okay, questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Okay, the question is, what's the cost?
Okay, the cost is reductive after we do so many of them. The first barrier is about $275 for the entire barrier, plus the pin, plus the pin's about $28, and the donut that you see there is $15 or $18, something of that sort. But if somebody comes in and says, look, I want to buy 5,000, we can reduce it by anywhere from 10 to 15, sometimes 20%.
Anybody else?
Depends.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. How do you get rid of old racing helmets? Well,
there's a display over in the research center, and there's room for more.
Well, let's talk about old racing helmets. There are two kinds of racing helmets, those that have taken a hit and those that haven't. A racing helmet that has taken a hit should be replaced. Even if the driver has not been seriously injured, even if the helmet kind of looks good, if there's impact on that helmet. And what I can tell you from IndyCar racing was that when we took the helmet off, it became our helmet. Drivers would ask for their helmets back. They didn't get one. If there was an impact mark on it, it went back to the helmet manufacturer to be analyzed.
And that's probably also the Snell Foundation would have been involved in some of that research as well. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Right now, the KISS barrier, the small barrier, that's about a third of the size of that, we've sold 1,300,000 of them. The bigger barrier is about 28 to 30,000. And there's probably, I don't know, 12, 15 tracks. They come in every day. So the factory has been running, fairly 6 days a week. But go ahead. Oh, no. What you're going to do, if you take a package there and you take it, there's a series of out of 45 articles that have been written about the subject, there's about 5 or 6 of them. And my PR gal is always, whatever business we're in, she's in the face of the industry, okay? And what's happening is it's starting to become a snowball. People hear about this, particularly drivers. As I said before, even being a track owner and working around tracks, the tracks are being educated. Let's put it that way. Okay, the question's going to be, how long is it going to take? And I'll be blunt with you. I've got a lot of blank stares, non-interest, but it's like a cow. Okay, to get its attention, you have to hit it in the head with a sledgehammer to get their attention to say, look, these guys are drivers. And if you're not sitting behind the wheel, then it's pretty difficult to get somebody to understand what death is or injury. Well, we are. Some of the sanctioning bodies get it, okay? They have to push the track owners. Some of the sanctioned bodies are receptive to it, but we're talking money here. Or change. We can show them a lot of our customers are new tracks. We've got some older tracks that are refitting and taking and putting into the high incident places. But the new tracks like Thermal, Area 27, Indy Motorsports, I've got 2 in Brazil, South America coming on. I got one I got a big customer in Australia. The problem is the shipping. I mean, the shipping is really, really expensive.
Well, if you go into a store and you're looking to buy a helmet, like a motorcycle helmet or something, you may see DOT. That's Department of Transportation. I'm looking around the room here. I don't think there's anybody's head that is worth less than what you would spend on a DOT helmet. So you want something that's better than that. Snell is still a standard, and Snell changes. There's Snell 2010. There's Snell, for different years. So the latest, or maybe one prior Snell rating. But FIA, the International Governing Body of Racing, has 8860. And 8860 starts out with a Snell helmet and then puts it through more rigorous tests. So that's really the gold standard that I know of, and that's what's required in IndyCar racing. FIA 8860. So you don't even have to, if it's FIA 8860, you don't have to ask about Snell because that's the ante to get in that game to be certified. But not every Snell rated helmet or certified helmet's 8860.
I have actually 2 questions. The first one is for the barrier system. Do you have any involvement with Formula E?
Not as yet. Right now, we're in right now we're going in front of the FIA. We got a call about 2 months ago, out of the blue. We had actually made some attempts a year and a half ago, and they called me from FIA and they said, "Look, we've seen your barrier. We've seen, you asked the question of, do we have outreach? I mean, it's kind of excessive, but we let me tell you, I know it. It must be something in my voice. The point being is now we're doing through certification right now up in Minnesota at a big test center. And if we get that certification through all of the different articles, as I said, the woman at FIA, she says, Mr. Valentine, we see you everywhere. I said, well, Glengarry, Glen Ross, always be selling. Okay? And that's been my life as sales.
Second question is for Mike. With regard to the iPass and the helmet removal, it's the same question. Is roughly when did this kind of research start, and how did it come about? What did it take to get to this point?
There's really two answers. iPass is fairly new technology that's just been certified by the the Food and Drug Administration. So I don't know all the history of iPass other than it's recently been certified. The whole concussion work has been done for at least 10 years that I know of by Steve Olvey and others who have worked with drivers. And Steve also consults with the Miami Dolphins and other football teams. And again, if you haven't seen the movie Concussion, that tells the best story, I think, about how a lot of this information was suppressed about concussion. So even in racing, we haven't had a lot of it. But we were dealing with concussions, probably from the time the second car was invented, right? Because that's when the first race happened. And now the science is getting to the point where it can really accurately diagnose a concussion, and things have changed. They used to tell the people that if you had a concussion, you had to go into like a dark room for 2 days and things like that. Now they're saying, no, you just have to continue activity, but at a lower level and certainly no high risk. And what they understand now more than others, and I give Dario and Dale Earnhardt Jr. probably the most credit for talking about this that used to really be kept secret. There are a lot of drivers, and I think many of you are old enough to remember these drivers who really had their bells rung and wouldn't talk about it. And now Dale Jr. took a hiatus from racing. Dario flat out quit. Steve Olvey told Dario after the Houston hit. So what happened with Dario was that he was in Houston on a temporary street course. The car went up in the air, caught the fence, the chain link fence, and snapped, and it spun. His concussion was not a frontal hit or a rear hit. It was a twist, with the brain kind of twisted in his head. And it wasn't the accident, which Dario didn't remember, that really showed him that he had a big problem. It was afterwards when he was in the hospital and didn't remember that he ate breakfast that morning. It was afterwards. Normally when somebody takes a hit, they don't remember the incident. If you've been in a car accident or if you've been in a racing accident, you may not remember it. You'll say, I woke up in the hospital. And that happens a lot. Dario woke up in the hospital and then still had a lot of memory problems. And he had I don't know how many, but multiple concussions before. He went to Miami. Steve checked him out and said, I got a place for you.